Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're heading somewhere both fascinating and, well, maybe just a little bit scandalous. We're going to Pompeii, that Roman city forever frozen in time after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and we're going to talk about what it was actually like to visit a brothel there. And don't worry, we're keeping this chill, relaxing, and very much in the tone you've come to expect from our long bedtime stories. Think of it as a soft, meandering journey through Roman nightlife, with the occasional wink at how weird, human, and honestly relatable people were 2,000 years ago. So, grab your blanket, settle in, and let's step quietly into the dimly lit streets of ancient Pompeii. Picture the scene. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and the streets are alive with the sounds of Roman evening life. Merchants are packing up their stalls, bakers are pulling the last loaves of bread from their ovens, and the taverns are just beginning to fill with chatter, clinking cups, and the sweet smell of wine mixed with grilled fish. You, a Roman citizen or perhaps a visitor passing through, have coins jingling in your pouch and a curiosity that pulls you down a side street, away from the respectable main forum. The further you walk, the more the noise changes. Laughter gets louder, a little rowdier, and lanterns glow from low doorways that promise more than a hot meal. Among these, tucked into the winding back streets, is a small building that looks ordinary at first glance. 2 stories, plastered walls, maybe a faded fresco outside. But the closer you get, the clearer it becomes that this is not just any house. Carved above the door is a rather unmistakable symbolon, erect phallus, grinning down at passers-by like some ancient neon sign. In Rome, subtlety wasn't exactly the priority when it came to advertising. You don't need to ask what kind of business goes on inside. The building itself is practically announcing it to the entire neighborhood. Now, entering a place like this in Pompeii wasn't the shameful, whispered about act it might later become in stricter societies. For Romans, sex was not tied to sin in the way we think of today. It was part of daily life, a natural appetite like hunger or thirst. And as long as you were a free man, visiting a brothel was not just acceptable, it was expected. Politicians, merchants, soldiers, and sailors all made their way to these little houses of pleasure. Even freedmen with a few coins to spare could indulge. The only ones who might risk scandal were women of high social standing, and they would not have been seen entering a place like this. But for everyone else, especially men of means, the brothel was a perfectly normal stop on a night out. Inside, the Lupana was dim, smoky, and surprisingly cramped. The air was thick with the mingled smells of oil lamps, cheap wine, perfume, and sweat. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on plastered walls, and in the main corridor, explicit frescoes decorated the rooms. These weren't random decorations either. Each painting depicted a sexual act, sometimes acrobatic, sometimes surprisingly tender, and they functioned almost like a menu for clients. If you couldn't speak Latin or if you were too drunk to negotiate, these frescoes made communication pretty straightforward. Point at the picture, hand over your coin, and business was settled. The rooms themselves were small, barely big enough for a narrow stone bed topped with a straw mattress. Privacy was minimal, no doors, just curtains or archways, and sound carried easily through the halls. It wasn't glamorous, not like the romanticized versions of ancient seduction you might see in movies. It was practical, straightforward, and transactional. But at the same time, there was an air of ritual to it, an unspoken understanding between client and worker that this exchange was as much about human connection as it was about money. The workers of these brothels were mostly enslaved women and men, brought in from across the empire: Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, with their own accents, looks, and allure. Their lives were hard, no doubt, and this work was rarely a choice. Yet within the walls of the Lupana, they became skilled performers of charm, wit, and companionship. They spoke in whispers, laughed at jokes, poured wine, and coaxed weary travelers into forgetting, at least for a little while, the burdens of daily life. Some were famed for their beauty, others for their humor, and some simply for their ability to listen. In that dim, smoky corridor, the distinctions of class and origin blurred, at least for the length of a transaction. Coins exchanged hands quickly. The standard rate, according to graffiti scribbled on the very walls of Pompeii, was just a few copper assises, the cost of a cheap loaf of bread. For a few more, you might linger longer, enjoy better wine, or choose from fresher linens. The walls themselves were covered in graffiti, left by satisfied customers and cheeky jokes from workers. Names, crude drawings, boasts about stamina, even ratings of particular women all scrawled into the plaster, like the Yelp reviews of the 1st century. Walking down those corridors today, archaeologists can still read the laughter and the lust of long-dead Romans, preserved in casual scratches for eternity. And yet, beyond the obvious, there's something striking about these places. For all their seediness, they were also deeply social. Men came not just for physical release but for the camaraderie of shared experience, the warmth of wine-soaked laughter, and the sense that here, in this smoky little house, the rules of the outside world bent just enough to allow freedom. Respectable senators might rub shoulders with sailors, merchants with freedmen, all equalized by desire and coin. For an hour, status mattered less than appetite. But of course, the reality for the workers was harsher. Life in a Pompeian brothel was demanding and often dangerous. Enslaved, their earnings went not to themselves but to the master who owned them. Their health was precarious, their prospects limited, and their days filled with endless repetition of the same smoky transactions. Some found ways to build connections with regular clients, even lovers who might one day purchase their freedom. Others lived and died within those narrow stone chambers, their names forgotten except for the occasional scratch of graffiti dot behind the laughter and the lurid. Frescoes was a story of survival, endurance, and humanity. So when you imagine stepping into a brothel in Pompeii, it isn't just a salacious curiosity, it's a window into Roman society itself. The way they treated sex and commerce, the way they mingled status and desire, the way even the most private acts became public through art and graffiti, it all tells us who they were. And as the oil lamps flicker, as the frescoes glow in the half-light, as the voices echo down narrow corridors, you realize you're not just in a brothel, you're standing in a time capsule of human experience, as messy, complicated, and deeply human as it has ever been. When you step back outside into the cool Pompeian night, blinking against the lantern glow, you realize how seamlessly the brothel blends into the life of the city. It's not tucked away in shame or hidden in some secret alley like you might imagine, but right in the heart of a bustling neighborhood. Archaeologists have found at least 35 brothels in Pompeii, some big, some just a single room, often located near bakeries, taverns, or bathhouses that made sense after a drink, a snack, or a hot soak. Well, a Roman man might have a certain appetite left to satisfy. Convenience was everything, and Pompeii's layout catered to it perfectly. You can almost imagine the flow of evening traffic, a merchant closing his stall, heading to the tavern for wine, stopping at the bakery for bread, and then slipping casually into the Lupana for one more indulgence before home. And it wasn't just brothels. The city itself was alive with sensual imagery. Everywhere you turned, there were phallic carvings, frescoes of Venus, statues of Priapus with his oversized fertility symbols. It sounds shocking to modern eyes, but to the Romans, this was normal decoration. A phallus carved into a wall wasn't obscene, it was good luck, a protective charm against the evil eye, a symbol of prosperity. So when you add that mindset to the existence of brothels, it makes sense. They didn't view sex as something dirty that needed to be hidden. It was out in the open, part of the art, part of the jokes, part of the graffiti. Visiting a brothel was just one more expression of a culture that wore its desires on its sleeve, more accurately, on its walls. Inside the brothel, though things were more complicated, clients saw it as leisure, but the workers saw it as survival. Most were enslaved women bought specifically for this purpose, though a few freedwomen and men also chose this work because it could bring faster money than other trades. Imagine being a Greek girl captured in war, shipped across the sea, and sold in Pompeii to a brothel owner. Your accent marks you as foreign, your looks make you exotic, and suddenly you're part of the menu frescoed above the door. Your body becomes both your cage and your currency. Yet within this harsh reality, women sometimes carved out niches of power. A witty tongue or a beautiful singing voice could make you more popular than simple looks. Regular customers might bring gifts or spread your reputation in graffiti, and once in a while, one might even buy your freedom. It was rare, but it happened. The brothel was a place of suffering, yes, but also of small strategies, survival tactics, and human resilience. And the clients, well, they weren't always noble patrons of art and conversation. Sometimes they were drunk, sometimes rough, sometimes careless with the workers' well-being. But the brothel was designed for efficiency. Narrow corridors kept traffic moving. Stone beds, easily cleaned, left little room for comfort. Graffiti served as both advertisements and warnings. One wall inscription might boast, "Success is the weaver, loves Iris, she who makes him burn for her." Another might crudely insult a rival, or mark a favorite worker with praise. It's startling, standing in those rooms today, to read the handwriting of someone 2,000 years gone, bragging about his stamina, or scribbling his name next to a lover's. It makes the ancient past suddenly intimate, almost uncomfortably so. For Romans, though, there wasn't much discomfort in it. Respectable men didn't expect their wives to satisfy every desire. Marriage was more about household and lineage than romance. Brothels, mistresses, and casual encounters were part of male life, and no one blinked an eye at it. A senator might pass laws in the forum by day and slip into a lupaina by night, and no scandal would follow. The only real stigma fell on free Roman citizens who worked in brothels, male or female. That was considered degrading, lowering your social standing, and could even disqualify you from certain legal rights. Enslaved workers, though, had no such protections to lose, so society didn't trouble itself with their reputation. The double standards were sharp, even casual, accepted by everyone. As you linger in the imagined corridor, hearing echoes of laughter and footsteps, you start to notice just how much detail the Romans put into their erotic frescoes. They weren't just functional menus, they were art, playful and sometimes humorous. One shows a woman balancing on top of a man in a pose that looks more like acrobatics than intimacy. Another shows couples gazing into each other's eyes, tender in a way you don't expect. These paintings remind us that Roman sexuality wasn't just about mechanics, it was about fantasy, role-play, humor. They made art out of their pleasures, and in the flickering light of an oil lamp, those images must have seemed vivid, enticing, and maybe even reassuring. For a client too shy to ask, pointing to a fresco was an easy way to communicate. For a worker, it was a way to guide expectations. It was marketing and instruction rolled into one, with a touch of creativity that made the lupaina distinct from any generic house of vice. But if we shift the view, if we think not as the client but as the worker, the scene changes again. Life in the lupaina wasn't about romance, it was about repetition, about keeping up the energy for one customer after another, about managing illness and exhaustion, about negotiating the fine line between pleasing the client and keeping yourself safe. There were rules, unspoken codes of conduct, and the looming authority of the pimp or brothel keeper, who collected the coins and enforced discipline. To him, the women were investments, property to be maintained, marketed, and if no longer profitable, discarded. Their worth was measured in copper, their survival in the number of clients they could handle before their bodies gave out. And yet, humanity sneaks in through the cracks. Archaeologists have found little trinkets, personal items, and even charms in those narrow rooms, evidence that workers held on to pieces of themselves, despite their circumstances. Maybe a small figurine of Venus, hoping for luck. Maybe a carved amulet against disease. Maybe graffiti written by the worker herself, a tiny act of self-expression scratched into the wall of her prison. These details remind us that behind the frescoes and coins and laughter, real people lived here. People with dreams, with memories of home, with hopes for something beyond the stone bed. The brothel becomes not just a place of ancient sex, but a place of stories. Countless human stories swallowed up in the eruption of Vesuvius. So as you walk through the brothel in your imagination, the oil lamps flickering, the air heavy with wine and perfume, the frescoes vivid and explicit, the laughter echoing from corridor to corridor, you're not just walking into scandal, you're walking into the heart of Roman life, into a culture that saw desire differently, into the lives of workers who left faint but stubborn marks on the walls, hoping someone, someday, would read their words. Pompeii froze them in time, and tonight, we're listening. As you continue wandering through Pompeii in your mind, you realize how perfectly ordinary the extraordinary once felt. To the men slipping in and out of brothels, to the women waiting behind stone beds, to the tavern keepers next door, this was just part of the neighborhood's rhythm. The sound of sandals on cobblestones, the smell of bread baking, the chatter spilling from a wine shop, the soft creak of a brothel door opening, none of it seemed scandalous in its time. That's the thing about the Romans. They didn't box desire away into shadows. They wove it into their cityscape, their jokes, their graffiti, their daily routines. Imagine the sheer normalcy of it. You're a shoemaker who just patched up someone's sandals. It's late, but you pass by the Lupanar on your way home, and you decide, well, why not step inside for a few minutes before dinner? Nobody gasps, nobody points fingers, because in this world, visiting a brothel is as unremarkable as grabbing a loaf of bread. But that doesn't mean every client felt carefree. There must have been nerves, awkwardness, the first-timers fumbling with coins, the bashful young men who avoided eye contact, and there must have been regulars, the ones who treated it like a second home, who knew the workers by name, who carved their affections into the walls with a dull stylus. The graffiti preserves those voices with startling clarity. Some scribbles are boastful, dripping with bravado. Others are tender, almost romantic, as if the brothel was the only place they felt brave enough to express affection. It's strange, isn't it? We think of ancient sex as raw, transactional, stripped of intimacy. And yet here in Pompeii, we find little love notes scratched into plaster. Men pouring out their hearts or their egos into a wall, hoping someone might read it. For the workers, each visitor must have blurred into the next, a parade of faces, each with his own smell of sweat, wine, or perfume. And still, maybe one stood out, maybe a kind word, a soft laugh, a shared joke broke through the monotony. In those rare moments, the brothel became something more than a factory of flesh, became human again. Imagine a concubine or enslaved girl leaning against the stone bed after a client left, giggling quietly to herself about something silly he said. For a brief moment, she wasn't property, she wasn't an object. She was just a girl, laughing at a joke in the middle of Pompeii's restless night. Step back into the streets, and you notice how seamlessly the Lupanar connects to everything else. Right nearby, there's a bakery where men line up for bread in the morning. There's a tavern where dice clatter on wooden tables, wine splashing as laughter fills the smoky air. And a little further, there's a bathhouse, where steam rises into the night sky, carrying with it the hum of voices, the slap of wet towels, the dripping of water echoing off marble walls. The brothel isn't isolated. It's part of this web. A man might start his evening with a soak, meet his friends at the tavern, then disappear into the Lupanar, or maybe he stumbles out of the brothel and heads straight to the bakery for a midnight snack. This interlocking of pleasure, appetite, and community made Pompeii throb with life. But let's pause for a moment, because what makes Pompeii so vivid isn't just the routines, it's the interruptions. It's the graffiti that says more than it should. It's the little amulets hidden in rooms. It's the sheer variety of people who walked those streets. Imagine the range of clients. Sailors with salt still in their hair, merchants jingling coins from the day's profits, freedmen eager to taste the privileges of their hard-won status, maybe even travelers from distant lands following the carved phalluses etched into stone to guide them. They all funneled into the same narrow corridors. They all sat on the same stone benches. They all pointed at the same frescoes to choose what they wanted. It was a crossroads of humanity, as democratic as Rome ever got, though only for the clients. For the workers, there was no democracy, only endurance. And the endurance was brutal. Imagine the toll on the body, the endless cycle of labor. Without modern medicine, infections spread easily, pregnancies ended abruptly, and disease lurked in every encounter. A worker might light a lamp, straighten her hairpin, plaster on a smile, and welcome the next client while silently fighting a fever or hiding her exhaustion. Archaeologists have even found skeletons that tell story signs of malnutrition, worn-down bones, stunted growth. These weren't glamorous lives. They were hard, short, and often forgotten, if not for the eruption that sealed their world in ash. Still, resilience shone through. Maybe one worker secretly taught herself to read scraps of graffiti, whispering letters under her breath when no one was listening. Maybe another pocketed a few coins to buy a trinket or charm, slowly building a hidden treasure. Maybe one sang songs from her homeland to remind herself of who she once was. These are the stories we can't prove but can imagine, because humans everywhere find ways to keep themselves whole, even when the world chips away at them. And then there's the city's role in all of this. Pompeii, before Vesuvius buried it, was vibrant, messy, loud, alive. The brothels were one part of its heartbeat, but so were the markets, the theaters, the temples. You could attend a gladiator match in the amphitheater, cheer until your throat was hoarse, grab a snack at a street stall, toss dice in a tavern, and then wander into a brothel all in the same day. That's how integrated it all was. Leisure, violence, food, sex, ritual, woven together into the tapestry of daily life. It makes you realize that to understand Pompeii, you can't separate the scandalous from the sacred, the frivolous from the serious. To them, it was all one continuum. And the ash did fall. That's what makes this all possible for us to picture so clearly. When Vesuvius erupted, it didn't just bury a city, it froze moments. The phalluses on walls, the graffiti confessions, the beds, the frescoes, all locked away like time capsules. The very walls of the Lupena became storytellers, waiting centuries for someone to read them. Without the eruption, Pompeii's brothel would have crumbled away, replaced by new buildings, forgotten like countless others. But with it, the laughter, the cries, the footsteps, and the whispers became echoes we can still follow. So as you lie here, listening to this tale, imagine yourself as both visitor and observer, as client and worker, as historian and dreamer. Walk the corridors, run your hand over the stone beds, read the graffiti out loud, follow the carved arrows down the street. Let the lamps flicker in your mind until you see the city glow again. And then, in the stillness of the night, remember that this place was once alive with breath, with touch, with desire, with struggle. Pompeii's Lupena isn't just a ruin, it's a mirror, reflecting both the joy and the weight of what it meant to be human. Long before the mountain took it all away, think about it for a moment. The sheer ordinariness of Pompeii's extraordinary pleasures. It wasn't a secret city of sin, no hidden Vegas in the shadow of a volcano. It was just life. And that's maybe the most startling part. For the Romans, walking past a brothel was like passing a shop or a tavern. The frescoes weren't considered scandalous, just advertisements. The sounds drifting through thin walls weren't shocking, just part of the neighborhood's hum. A family might live upstairs, children playing in a courtyard, while below, the Lupena carried on its trade. The blending of innocence and indulgence in the same building shows how differently Romans thought about boundaries. And yet, boundaries did exist, lines drawn by class, gender, and freedom. A free-born Roman woman couldn't step foot into a brothel as a customer. It would have been unthinkable. A free Roman citizen, male or female, who worked there as a prostitute, lost certain protections of law and respect. But for enslaved women, choice never entered the picture. They were part of the furniture, as coldly interchangeable as the stone beds themselves. Their voices were rarely recorded, except maybe in a graffito here or there. And yet, they were the ones who kept the whole system running. Their bodies carried the city's appetite, even as the city turned its head away from their suffering. Imagine one of them, let's call her Bion, a Greek girl sold into slavery after her city was conquered. She's brought to Pompeii, handed to a brothel keeper, and led into a tiny stone room. A bed, a lamp, maybe a small niche for offerings. That's her world. She doesn't know the language at first, but she learns quickly, picking up enough Latin to understand demands, to smile at jokes she only half grasps. At night, after the last client leaves, she traces patterns on the wall with her finger, maybe humming a song from home. She can't write graffiti, not yet, but she dreams of learning, of leaving her name behind. 2,000 years later, an archaeologist finds her room, sees the faint scratches, and wonders who she was. Dione's story is gone, but in imagining her, we restore a little humanity to the silence. Then there were the clientsmen from every walk of life. A Roman soldier, leather straps still dusted from the road, tossing a coin with a grin. A freedman, proud of his new status, determined to enjoy every privilege. A wealthy merchant, smelling of foreign spices, slipping through the door after dinner. Even teenage boys, accompanied by older men, learning the rites of passage in a culture that taught masculinity through indulgence. Each of them found themselves in the same narrow hallway, squinting at the flicker of oil lamps, brushing shoulders in the cramped corridor, pretending not to notice one another as they made their way into private rooms. And above all of this, Pompeii's sky loomed, calm for now, hiding the mountain's quiet menace. Nobody knew what was coming. Nobody imagined that all these nightly routines, all this ordinary business, would be sealed in ash and rediscovered centuries later by wide-eyed archaeologists. The irony is almost unbearable. These men and women went about their business thinking only of the moment, the coin, the pleasure, the weariness, and yet their world was destined to be preserved in eerie detail, studied by generations who would marvel, blush, and whisper about their lives. Step back into the Lupena, and you feel how small the rooms really are. Narrow doorways, beds barely long enough, walls closing in, yet somehow they echo with voices. The laughter of a drunken client, the soft murmur of a promise, the scrape of a stylus carving another line into the wall, and over time, the graffiti piled up. Names, boasts, drawings, insults. One scrawled message says simply, "I screwed well here." Another declares undying love for a worker named Iris. Another is so clumsy, the letters crooked, that you can almost see the shaky hand of someone drunk on wine. Together, they form a mosaic of desire, ego, and longing, a chorus of human voices whispering from 2 millennia away. The frescoes added another layer of communication. Painted in bright colors, they offered a kind of menu, showing different acts with startling explicitness. A client could point and indicate his choice without words. To us, it seems crude, but to the Romans, it was practical. And there's artistry in them, tooth a curl of a woman's hair, the folds of a draped cloth, the way figures gaze at one another. These weren't hastily slapped-on images. They were painted with care, perhaps even pride. The brothel wasn't ashamed of its purpose. It celebrated it in art. Imagine the glow of those paintings under lamplight. The colors alive, the figures almost moving in the shadows. It must have been both alluring and reassuring, a reminder that desire was not a secret but a shared, accepted part of life. Outside, the city buzzed. Dice games clattered. Water gurgled from fountains. Merchants haggled even after dark. Somewhere, a poet recited verses by torchlight, and in the Lupena life went on, night after night, until the day the sky turned black. The eruption didn't discriminate. It buried taverns, bakeries, villas, and brothels alike. Workers and clients alike vanished into ash, their final moments sealed away. Today, we walk through their rooms as tourists, peering at frescoes, chuckling nervously at graffiti, marveling at how open the Romans were. But if we pause long enough, the laughter dies down, and we hear the echoes, footsteps, whispers, the rustle of cloth, the clink of coins. That's the strange magic of Pompeii. It isn't just ruins, it's a conversation, frozen and waiting. And in the case of the brothel, it's a particularly intimate one. It forces us to confront the fact that history isn't just about emperors and battles. It's about everyday lives, about workers and clients, about pleasure and pain. The Lupena isn't a footnote, it's a chapter. And when we read it, we learn not only about Rome's appetites, but about its humanity. In all its messy, complicated, contradictory forms. If you let your imagination linger a little longer, the Lupena becomes more than a ruin, more than a curiosity tucked into a tourist's itinerary. It becomes a breathing, pulsing fragment of daily life, woven seamlessly into the larger fabric of Pompeii. Because what you need to picture is not just the narrow hallways or the stone beds. You need to picture the rhythm of the entire street outside, and how those rhythms converged at this very doorway. A baker across the way rises before dawn to knead dough, his arms powdered white with flour, his oven glowing. Just next to him, a tavern owner shouts at delivery boys carrying amphorae of cheap wine. A child chases a ball past the carved phallus on the wall that points the way to the brothel. And through it all, men pass in and out of the doorway, exchanging nods, tucking their togas just so, adjusting sandals as if nothing unusual has occurred. For the city, it was ordinary, almost invisible, because it was everywhere. And that's what strikes you most when you think about Pompeii, how openly sexuality was displayed, not as rebellion or provocation, but as part of the natural order. Phallic symbols decorated bakeries, fountains, even household shrines. They were seen not just as sexual emblems, but as protective charms against envy and misfortune. Imagine standing at a street corner and seeing a carving of Priapus, god of fertility, grinning down at you. His exaggerated form meant not to shock but to bless prosperity. And then, a few paces away, the doorway of a Lupena welcomes you in. No shame, no secrecy, just another service in a city that catered to every appetite. Still, when you step inside, the weight of reality sinks in. Those frescoes glowing in lamplight weren't just decorative, they were the working tools of women who had no choice. Their painted bodies represented the real ones sitting on stone beds behind thin walls. To the men who pointed at the frescoes, it was fantasy. To the women, it was instruction, obligation, and that tension between desire and despair hung in the air of every room. Imagine the worker smoothing her hair, adjusting her robe, waiting for the next knock on the door, forcing a smile as footsteps echoed in the hallway. For her, the frescoes weren't promises of play, they were reminders of duty. And yet, duty could blur into survival strategies. A clever worker might charm a client into becoming a repeat visitor, securing gifts or favors. She might learn to flatter one man's ego, to laugh at another's joke, to provide more than flesh, a sense of being wanted, admired, listened to. And in that, perhaps, she carved out tiny pieces of control in a world that offered her none. The graffiti refined boasts of lovers, declarations of devotion hint that sometimes workers succeeded in making themselves unforgettable. Maybe Iris, whose name appears on the walls, was more than a fleeting encounter to someone. Maybe her laughter echoed in his ears long after he left, enough to make him scratch her name into plaster for eternity. Outside the brothel, society turned a blind eye to the suffering within, but it consumed its product eagerly. Roman men were expected to indulge, to prove virility through conquest, not only in war but in bed. Marriage was for heirs and alliances, but pleasure was sought elsewhere, and Pompeii provided it in abundance. Imagine a senator from Rome visiting the city, hearing of its vibrant nightlife, strolling past taverns and bathhouses, and finally entering the loop. For him, it was just another perk of wealth and status. For the worker he chose, it was another night of endurance. These unequal exchanges played out countless times, night after night, until the mountain ended it all. The irony is that, for all their openness, Romans still judged harshly those who crossed invisible lines. A free-born Roman citizen who prostituted themselves would be marked as infamous, disgraced, stripped of certain rights. Yet the same society applauded the men who paid for those services, who scrawled their names proudly on walls. It's a contradiction as old as civilization itself. Freedom for some, stigma for others, hypocrisy written into law and custom. And Pompeii's brothel, preserved in ash, lays that hypocrisy bare for us to examine centuries later. As you picture the scene again, the oil lamps flicker, the walls seem to close in, the laughter fades into whispers, the whispers into silence. You can almost sense the mountain looming, quiet and watchful. The people inside had no idea they were being recorded, their lives captured in layers of pumice and ash. They couldn't imagine that future generations would shuffle through these halls, guidebooks in hand, blushing at frescoes, chuckling nervously at graffiti. They lived only in their moment, in the heat of their desire or the exhaustion of their duty. And perhaps that's the lesson, that history is always built on moments like these. Ordinary to the people living them, extraordinary to those who look back. But before the ash, there was life. Picture one last night in Pompeii. The taverns are loud, the bathhouses steaming, the amphitheater emptying after a performance. Men drift through the streets, coins in hand, following carved arrows to the loop. The women inside prepare, adjusting robes, lighting lamps, steeling themselves. Somewhere, a client scribbles a line of graffiti before stumbling out into the night. Somewhere else, a worker hums softly, clutching a tiny amulet for luck. The city is alive, pulsing with its ordinary, extraordinary rhythms. And then, quietly, inevitably, the mountain stirs. The night lingers in Pompeii, and the brothel breathes along with it, the rhythm of footsteps, laughter, and sighs mingling with the distant barking of dogs and the crackling of torches along the street. It's easy to imagine yourself pausing at the doorway, the heavy curtain pulled back, letting in a sliver of cooler air. The smell of the city clings, even here wine, bread, sweat, smoke from oil lamp sand. It wraps around every visitor and every worker inside. To the men who enter, the world beyond that curtain falls away. For a few minutes or an hour, the Lupaina is the entire universe. And to the women, trapped in their routines, this doorway is both cage and livelihood, hope and despair in equal measure. Now, close your eyes and picture the sounds more closely. Not just voices, but the clatter of coins dropped onto a stone counter, the murmur of men negotiating, the scrape of sandals along the rough floor. Then, behind the thin partitions, the softer sounds, whispers, laughter, feigned or genuine. The groan of a stone bed as weight shifts. It's a symphony of intimacy and transaction, where nothing is hidden and yet nothing is fully seen. The city outside doesn't pause. The baker continues kneading, the tavern continues pouring, the children continue chasing each other through narrow alleys. And all the while, the Lupaina hums like a heart at the center of it all. Think for a moment of the frescoes again, those bright, unabashed paintings of acts, too explicit for polite conversation. They've lasted because ash sealed them away. But when they were first painted, they glowed fresh with color, alive with suggestion. A new visitor might linger in the hall, staring up, uncertain which door to choose. The paintings gave him confidence, like a menu guiding his appetite. But they also served another role: entertainment. Imagine a drunk patron stumbling in, laughing with his friends, pointing at the frescoes, making jokes, turning the art into a spectacle before ever stepping into a room. The walls themselves joined in the performance, playing their silent part in the theater of desire. And yet, behind the theater was reality. The women who leaned against those stone beds lived lives defined by boundaries they did not choose. Some may have been enslaved, forced into service by owners who saw them not as people, but as investments. Others may have drifted into prostitution because poverty offered no other options. A very few may have chosen it, chasing independence or income. But even they operated under a cloud of stigma. For a Roman matron, the Lupaina was a shameful place. For a Roman man, it was recreation. For the women inside, it was survival. That imbalance lay heavy in the air, more present than the frescoes, more lasting than the laughter. Picture one of these women. We'll give her no name, because the graffiti has recorded only a few. She adjusts her tunic, ties her hair, breathes deeply as the curtain stirs. A man enters. She doesn't know if he will be kind or cruel, if he will speak or stay silent, if he will remember her or forget her instantly. She doesn't know how many coins he carries, or how much of that will reach her hands. All she knows is that she must smile, she must please, she must endure. And in the moments when the curtain falls closed again, when the man leaves and footsteps echo down the hall, she has only silence and the faint glow of a lamp for company. Perhaps she hums to herself. Perhaps she whispers a prayer to Venus, goddess of love, asking for gentleness, for fortune, for anything but indifference. Now, let's step outside again. The city itself carried no shame in what happened behind the curtain. Prostitutes were registered with officials, taxed for their services, categorized like any other trade. The brothel, in that sense, was simply another shop, its wares measured in coin, its customers tracked by the scribbles they left behind. But even in this regulated openness, society drew lines. A woman who sold herself could never hope for high social standing. She might live, she might even scrape together some comfort, but she would never be honored as a wife of status. For the men, however, a visit here left no mark. They could boast, they could write their conquests into graffiti, and still return home to families, to politics, to respectability. That double standard was so ingrained that few ever questioned it. And yet, Pompeii's brothel wasn't just a place of cruelty. Within its walls, strange little human connections flickered. A client might fall into routine, returning again and again to the same woman, seeking something more than flesh. A worker might share laughter with a patron, might exchange a secret, might just for a moment forgive the transaction and feel like a person instead of a product. These moments didn't erase the imbalance, but they did add texture to lives otherwise defined by duty. The graffiti proves it. Names carved alongside endearments, crude drawings next to heartfelt words. Some men left marks as if to say, I was here. Others carved as if to say, she mattered. Both types of scratches remain, frozen in the walls, silent echoes of human longing. If you think of the Lupaina now, you might feel a strange blend of emotions: fascination, discomfort, even sadness. And that's natural, because history is never tidy. It asks us to sit with contradiction, with the beauty of the frescoes and the pain behind them, with the laughter of clients and the silence of workers, with the openness of Roman sexuality and the cruelty of Roman inequality. To visit the brothel in your imagination is to confront all of this at once, to let the past whisper its messy truths into your ear. And as the night of Pompeii wears on, the brothel doesn't sleep. One man leaves, another enters. Lamps flicker, coins clink, laughter rises, sighs fade. Outside, the mountain broods, silent and watchful, its heart already stirring, though no one yet knows. Tomorrow will come, as ordinary as today, and then, one day, tomorrow will not. But for now, life continues, the Lupaina buzzing with the eternal rhythm of desire and survival, until the very moment ash turns sound into silence forever. Dawn begins to creep toward Pompeii, though in the narrow streets around the brothel, light arrives slowly. The shutters of bakeries creak open, smoke curls once again from ovens, and vendors call out as they arrange their wares. But the Lupaina does not rest. It simply changes tempo. The busiest hours may be after dark, when wine has loosened tongues and purses, but mornings carry their own trafficmen slipping in before the duties of the day, slaves sent by masters with a few coins and permission, travelers who have just entered the city gates and want to taste its offerings before they move on. The brothel lives by the same rhythm as the market and the bathhouse, open, reliable, ordinary, and yet, within those walls, nothing feels ordinary. The women stir from restless sleep, if they've slept at all. Some rise stiffly from stone beds that never truly soften beneath layers of straw. They comb their hair with bone pins, wash quickly with cold water from basins, and prepare for another day of endurance. There's little privacy, only thin partitions separating one life from another, so the sound of a neighbor humming or coughing bleeds through. In such closeness, perhaps friendships formed, perhaps rivalries burned. One can imagine whispered conversations in the brief stillness between clients' small jokes, small comforts, or complaints about aching backs and empty stomachs. The Lupena was not just a workplace. For many, it was the entirety of existence, morning to night, year after year. If you picture the street outside, it's alive with movement. A merchant with a cart full of figs trundles past, calling out prices. A pair of boys balance amphorae of wine between them, grunting as they navigate potholes and the paving stones. A stray dog noses at scraps near the gutter, and a fountain gurgles with fresh water. Through it all, the painted phallus on the corner wall points the way, as clear and unquestioned as a signpost. Nobody blushes at it. Nobody pretends it isn't there. For Pompeians, it's as normal as a shop sign showing a loaf of bread or a jug of oil. Sexual commerce wasn't a hidden vice. It was woven into the fabric of the city itself. Now, imagine following one particular visitor, a freedman who has earned modest wealth from his small tavern. He carries himself with the swagger of someone who has climbed a little higher than where he began, and he jingles a few coins in his purse. For him, the brothel is not just release, it is proof of status. Once, as a slave, his desires were not his own to indulge freely. Now, with money in hand, he claims a new kind of freedom, though built upon the exploitation of others. He steps through the doorway, nods at the familiar frescoes, and chooses a room. For the woman waiting inside, he is not freedom but routine, another body in an endless line. She greets him anyway, because survival demands it, and the curtain falls. These moments, so ordinary for Pompeii, are startling to us, because they were preserved in such detail. The graffiti scratched into the plaster remains vivid. Names, boasts, crude drawings, even reviews of workers. One might say, "I slept with Fortunata, she's lovely." Another might proclaim, "Myrtus charges 2 asses." The walls became a diary of desire, written not by historians but by clients in fleeting bursts of bravado. Imagine the workers reading those scratches by lamplight, knowing their names would outlast them in this most unusual archive. Did they laugh? Did they feel shame? Or did they simply shrug, accustomed to being discussed and displayed like goods in the marketplace? The frescoes to hold stories we can only guess at. Some scholars believe they offered instructions for clients unfamiliar with certain acts. Others suggest they were advertisements, promising variety. But perhaps they were also a way for workers to hint at specialties, or for artists to leave behind their own mischievous signatures in paint. Whatever their purpose, they remind us that the line between art and labor was blurry here. What we see as museum pieces were, to Pompeians, practical tools of commerce, part of a business model designed to entice and instruct. Still, beyond the mechanics, there was always the undercurrent of humanity. Picture one woman, exhausted after a long night, sneaking a bite of bread between clients. Another adjusts a small bronze charm she wears on a cord, hoping it will ward off illness or bring luck. Another stares at the frescoes, her mind drifting far from the dim room, imagining fields she will never see again, or children she will never raise. Their lives were not frozen statues. They were moving, breathing, complicated, full of small hopes and crushing realities. The Lupina may have been ordinary in Pompeii, but for those inside, it was anything but. Step back outside once more. The city buzzes louder as the sun climbs. Vendors shout, wagons rattle, temple bells ring, and the smell of fresh bread drifts through alleys. A passerby glances at the brothel doorway without surprise. He knows what lies within, as everyone does. Yet he moves on, thinking of other errands, other pleasures. That's the paradox of the Lupina. It was central to Pompeii's identity and invisible at the same time. both indispensable and overlooked. Only when Vesuvius erupted, coating the city in ash, did it become eternal, an unwilling time capsule for us to explore centuries later. And so, as you imagine yourself there, standing in the middle of the street with morning sunlight spilling over terracotta rooftops, you realize you are not just visiting a brothel. You are visiting a piece of everyday life, as vital to Pompeii as its baths, its theaters, its markets. The people who walked through these doors lived and breathed and joked and suffered, unaware that their routines would one day become history, preserved in walls and ashes. They lived not for us, not for textbooks or tourists, but for themselves, in fleeting moments of desire, of survival, of endurance. And that is why the Lupaina still speaks, whispering its truths across the centuries. As the day unfolds in Pompeii, the Lupaina slips seamlessly into the background hum of the city, its existence neither denied nor celebrated, simply accepted. Around noon, the sun beats down on the paving stones, heating the walls until they shimmer. Street vendors hawk olives, garum, and loaves of bread, their voices echoing against the stone. Children dart past with wooden hoops, and in the distance, you can hear the faint roar of the amphitheater where gladiators are training. Through it all, the brothel's doorway remains open, a steady trickle of visitors slipping inside. To a casual observer, it is just another business along the bustling Via dell'Abbondanza, no more remarkable than a bakery or a tavern. But inside, the world is heavy with shadows, lamplight, and whispered bargains. At midday, the frescoes glow faintly, their colors muted without the aid of oil lamps. The rooms feel smaller, hotter, more confining. Workers may fan themselves with scraps of fabric, trying to keep sweat from ruining their carefully prepared appearances. A few lean against the stone beds, catching brief moments of rest. The thin walls carry sound so clearly that one woman can hear her neighbor coughing, another humming a tune to pass the time. Privacy was never truly possible here. Even solitude was shared. And yet, within those walls, each woman carried her own story, her own memories of how she had come to be here, her own small rituals for surviving another day. Consider the kinds of men who entered at this hour. Soldiers on leave from drills at the barracks, their bronze helmets gleaming in the sunlight outside, might swagger in with the confidence of youth. Merchants from the forum, having sold their wares, might stop for a diversion before heading home. Even slaves, given a few coins by indulgent masters, found their way here. The Lupaina was a place where status briefly blurred. A senator's son and a common soldier might pass one another in the hallway, neither acknowledging the other, both bound by the same hunger. Inside the rooms, however, status reasserted itself. The man held coins, the woman obeyed. Power shifted only in the most fleeting of ways, but not every encounter was cruel. Imagine one client lingering after the act, speaking softly, asking questions. Perhaps he tells a story about his family, or asks about hers. Perhaps, for a few minutes, the transaction becomes a conversation. These moments, however rare, might have been cherished by the women. Tiny sparks of human recognition in a life otherwise reduced to routine. The graffiti suggests such bonds existed, with names paired together, with boasts written not just of the act but of affection. Did these connections last? Likely not. But in a place where hours blurred, even temporary kindness could feel monumental. Now, picture the graffiti itself. The walls were like a communal notebook. One man scrawls, "Meth is the best." Another, more crude, sketches a crude drawing. Someone else records the price he paid, perhaps his bragging rights, perhaps as simple information for others. These scratches of stylus into plaster were not meant to be immortal, and yet, here they are, still visible centuries later, echoing the voices of men who never imagined their private jokes and boasts would be studied in museums. For the women, their names became history not through their own voices, but through the scribbles of those who used them. That irony lingers like a shadow, reminding us how icily some lives are silenced, even as they are recorded. Outside, the heat intensifies, and the city hums with midday energy. At fountains, people gather to fill jugs. At the forum, magistrates argue cases. At the baths, men and women alike gossip while soaking in pools of warm water. The brothel, meanwhile, continues its business without pause. There is no holiday for those within. Desire pays no attention to festivals or siestas. Perhaps the workers envied the bustle outside, longed for the freedom to wander the stalls, to buy a sweet cake from a vendor, to sit in the shade of a colonnade. Instead, they remained in their dim corridors. The world reduced to frescoes and footsteps. Think for a moment about how the Romans rationalized all of this. To them, sexuality was not sacred or shameful, it was natural, like eating or drinking. They regulated prostitution, taxed it, and acknowledged it openly. And yet, the workers themselves bore stigma. They were marked as infame, stripped of respectability, unable to rise in status. Men indulged without consequence. Women endured with lifelong cost. This contradiction sat at the heart of Roman society, and Pompeii's Lupana reveals it more clearly than any law or text. To walk those halls in your mind is to confront both the frankness of Roman desire and the cruelty of Roman hierarchy. As afternoon approaches, the rhythm slows. Clients thin out, saving their coins for evening revelry. The women seize these rare lulls for rest, stretching out on stone beds, closing their eyes for brief, uneasy sleep. In their dreams, perhaps they return to childhood homes, to green fields or busy harbors, to lives before the loop, or perhaps dreams themselves are haunted, echoing with footsteps and laughter, never letting them truly escape. For even in silence, the brothel's presence pressed down, as heavy as the walls themselves. And yet, life went on. Outside, children laughed, merchants argued, priests chanted prayers at temples. The mountain loomed in the distance, its slopes peaceful, its peak faintly hazy in the afternoon sun. No one paid it much attention. It had always been there, steady and silent. The people of Pompeii lived as if tomorrow were guaranteed, and so the brothel remained busy, one doorway among thousands, unaware that its frescoes and graffiti would one day outlive empires. The sun drifts lower in the sky, painting Pompeii in warm amber light, and the city begins to shift its rhythm again. Merchants pack away their stalls, tying up goods beneath awnings. Children, still full of energy, are called home by mothers leaning from upper windows. At the bathhouses, the crowds grow thick, men and women soaking, gossiping, and preparing for the evening ahead. In the taverns, laughter grows louder as wine flows freely, and with each cup emptied, inhibitions loosen. It is in these twilight hours that the brothel comes alive once more. Its lamps lit, its walls glowing with the faint shimmer of painted bodies, its corridors filling with the echoes of footsteps. Picture yourself walking down the narrow street as the lamps are lit. The carved phallus at the corner catches the last light of the sun, its message as clear now as it was 2,000 years ago. Men begin to gather at the doorway, some confidently striding in, others lingering with nervous excitement. A few glance over their shoulders, though not from shame, only to check who else might see. After all, there was little scandal in entering the Luptina, but gossip was always a currency in Pompeii, and no one wanted the wrong story told about them. Inside, however, the curtain fell across the doorway and the outside world disappeared. The frescoes flicker in lamplight now, their colors warmer, their forms more enticing. They set the stage for the night's business, each scene promising pleasure, each painting reminding clients that every fantasy had its place behind one of those thin walls. The women prepare themselves for the rush, hair smoothed, tunics adjusted, faces set in practiced expressions. For some, it is a mask worn so often that it feels like part of their skin. For others, it is armor, a way to separate the self that endures from the self that performs. When the first footsteps echo in the hallway, they take a deep breath, ready for another night of repetition. The clientele now is more varied. Drunken men stumbling from taverns arrive in groups, laughing too loudly, their sandals scraping against stone. Wealthier citizens come alone or with friends, seeking discreet indulgence before returning to their villas. Even travelers, merchants passing through with cargo. Soldiers stopping on their way to another posting step inside, drawn by the reputation of Pompeii's pleasures. The Lupina, after all, was famous not just in its own city, but throughout the region. Those frescoes and those walls were well known, spoken of in whispers and laughter wherever men gathered. To visit Pompeii and not step through this doorway was to some like missing the amphitheater or the baths. Inside, the rhythm builds. Coins clink, curtains sway, voices murmur. The women move from one client to the next, their bodies the machinery that keeps the business turning. And yet, within the machinery, there are moments of startling humanity. A woman laughs genuinely at a joke, her smile breaking through the routine. Another offers a gentle word to a nervous young man, steadying his hands as if she were the experienced one guiding him into adulthood. A third endures a rough encounter, her eyes fixed on the fresco above, retreating inward to a place where no one else can follow. The walls hear it all, absorb it all, holding secrets that would remain sealed until ash recorded them forever. The graffiti grows with the night, men scratching words into plaster, some crude, some playful, some unexpectedly tender. "I love Fortunata," one writes, though perhaps he scrawled the same for another woman the night before. Another boasts of his virility, leaving behind not just memory but ego etched into the wall. Each mark is both fleeting and eternal, fleeting to the man who wrote it, eternal to the history it became. Imagine the women glancing at these scribbles the next day, rolling their eyes, or perhaps smiling faintly at recognition. Their names, tied to desire, outlasted their faces, their voices, their lives. And all the while, outside the Lupena, Pompeii thrums with life. Music drifts from taverns, dice rattle across tabletops. The scent of roasted meat mingles with the salt of the nearby sea. Lovers walk together beneath torchlight. Gladiators swagger. After training, children finally drift to sleep. The city feels eternal, alive in every stone and every alley. The mountain looms in the distance, dark against the night sky, silent as always, giving no hint of the fire within. No one glances at it tonight. Why would they? Life, in all its messy, noisy, beautiful ordinariness, is more than enough. Inside the brothel, the hours blur. The women measure time not by the position of the stars but by the number of clients, the weight of coins, the ache in their limbs. Some men linger, talking long after they've paid, unwilling to return to empty houses. Others leave quickly, pulling their togas tight, faces already turned toward the next destination. The workers remain, waiting, always waiting, until footsteps return. Between encounters, silence fills the rooms, heavy and thick, broken only by the sputter of a lamp or the shuffle of a neighbor. In those silences, perhaps the women dreamed, not of escape, they knew better than to hope too wildly, but of small mercies, a kind client, a quiet night, a few extra coins tucked away. And so the night stretches on, the Lupina alive with flickering light and shifting shadows, until at last the city outside grows quieter. The taverns empty, the dice games end, the streets fall still. Only the brothel continues, its lamps burning, its doors never fully closed. For as long as men walked Pompeii's streets, for as long as coins clinked in purses, the Lupina was ready, and the women, weary but unbroken, carried on. Their stories written not in books, but in the silent endurance of another night. As the night deepens, the Lupena feels like a world apart from the sleeping city outside. The narrow hallway glows with lamplight, smoke curling toward the ceiling, shadows stretching across the walls where frescoes shimmer with their painted bodies. For the men who step inside at this hour, the air itself seems charged to occur, heavier, scented with oil, sweat, and the faint sweetness of perfume. The rhythm of footsteps echoes against stone, curtains shift, coins exchange hands. For the women, it is just another part of the endless cycle, but for each client, it is a night to remember. That was always the paradox: routine for the worker, memory for the visitor. That the brothel's reputation drew many, but not everyone came for the same reasons. Some sought quick relief, efficient and transactional. Others came for companionship, the illusion of tenderness in a rented embrace. A lonely sailor might pour out his troubles to a woman who had no choice but to listen. A young man, nervous and inexperienced, might walk away feeling transformed, convinced he had touched something eternal. Each man carried his own story into the small, stone-walled rooms, and each left a little different than he had entered. The women, however, carried all of it: the stories, the emotions, the weight of being confidant, performer, healer, and stranger all at once. And still the walls watched silently. Imagine those frescoes above each bed, painted centuries ago, fading slightly in the smoky air but still vibrant. They were more than just decoration, they were instruction manuals, advertisements, encouragements. Men often pointed at them, requesting what they saw. The women, accustomed to this, complied with practiced motions, but sometimes, in the quiet moments, a woman might gaze at the painted figures herself, wondering who the artists had been, whether the women painted there had once lived and laughed in Pompeii. The art became a mirror of desire, but also a reminder of permanence. When their bodies were gone, when the nights blurred together, the paintings remained. Outside, the streets grew darker, torches guttered out, one by one. The city held its breath in those hours before dawn, when only the watchmen walked their rounds. But inside the Lupena, the last client still drifted in. The wealthy men often came late, after dinners and drinking, their breath heavy with wine. They laughed loudly, careless of who heard them. The poorer came earlier, anxious to spend what little they had before the night grew too late. But in these final hours, there was often an intimacy not found earlier. The drunken bravado softened, the masks slipped. A man might hold a woman close longer than necessary, as if he dreaded the return to an empty bed. Sometimes, there was even laughter that felt real, a shared joke, an accidental stumble, the brief connection of two people who, for a heartbeat, forgot the roles they played. But those moments always ended. The curtain fell back across the doorway, the coins clinked into the keeper's hand, and the cycle reset. The women knew better than to cling to such illusions. They were as fleeting as the smoke of a lamp flame dot by now. The women were tired. Their bodies ached. Their voices were hoarse from murmuring words of comfort or play. Some leaned against walls when no one was looking, letting their eyes close for just a second. Others counted coins in their minds, tallying whether the night had been worth the effort. Yet no matter how weary they felt, the expectation never changed. When the curtain opened, they straightened, smiled, and became what the client wanted them to be. It was survival dressed in charm. The graffiti on the walls whispered back to them. Every word carved into plaster was like an echo of nights just like this. Boasts of lovers, promises of return, crude drawings left by men too drunk to spell their own names. The women sometimes traced the marks with their fingers in idle moments, half amused, half resigned. They must have known, even if they couldn't imagine the scale, that these scratches would last longer than they would. Their bodies would vanish, but the words remained, stubborn as the stone itself. And through it all, the city outside slept on, unaware of how fragile its nights truly were. Pompeii had survived earthquakes before. Life had always resumed. People believed in tomorrow with a certainty born of routine. The markets would open again. The amphitheater would roar again. The Lupena would welcome clients again. No one imagined that the same mountain looming in the distance could erase it all in a single day. To them, it was eternal. To us, it is haunting. But for this night, the world still turned. A final client entered, laughter still hanging on his lips, and slipped behind a curtain. The keeper sat by the entrance, counting coins. The soft clink like a lullaby to the workers who leaned against walls, waiting for the last call. Lamps flickered low, their oil nearly spent. Shadows stretched longer, reaching across floors and beds like dark fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed faintly, announcing that dawn was not far away. And in those last tired hours, when the Lupena quieted and the city outside stirred toward morning, you could almost imagine the women breathing a little easier. The night was nearly over. They had survived another cycle, endured another parade of strangers. Soon the doors would close, the lamps would be snuffed, and silence would return. For a few hours at least, they would rest, until the sun climbed high again, until footsteps echoed once more, until the cycle began all over. When the Lupena finally exhaled into silence, it was not the silence of peace but of exhaustion. The lamps burned low, the last client stumbled back into the night, and the women were left with the fading echoes of laughter, groans, and whispered promises that would never be remembered by morning. Curtains hung limp, coins lay in little heaps on wooden tables, and the air itself seemed tired, thick with smoke and the residue of too many bodies pressed together in too small a space. To step outside into the cool night after such hours must have been like waking from a fever dream. But most women did not go home. The brothel was home or prison, depending on how you looked at it. Imagine one of them sitting on the edge of a bed. Once the curtain was finally drawn for good, she loosens the pins from her hair, shakes it free, rubs the sore spots from her arms where hands have gripped too tightly. She thinks of nothing and everything at once. Perhaps she hums softly, an old song from her childhood, or perhaps she sits in silence, staring at the painted figures on the wall, wondering how many more nights she will have to endure the same rituals. The bed is not soft, the blanket is rough, but for the moment it feels like sanctuary. The keeper, meanwhile, locks the entrance. His night is not finished. He still must tally the accounts. The women may have given themselves, but money is the true currency of the loop. Each coin is counted, each fraction of a denarius noted, each cut of the profits separated. The system is precise, because it has to be. Rome's world was built on order, even in its most hidden corners, and so while the women finally lay down, their bodies heavy with fatigue, The scratching of the keeper's stylus on his wax tablet continues into the early hours. Outside, the first traces of dawn creep over Pompeii. The faint glow on the horizon softens the darkness, turning black to blue, blue to the promise of light. The city stirs. Bakers begin to fire their ovens, filling the streets with the smell of warm bread. Farmers lead animals through the gates, their footsteps steady against the cobblestones. The market prepares to open, and yet, within the brothel's walls, sleep still clings stubbornly to the women who earned it. Their day does not begin with the sunrise. Their day begins when desire awakens again, when footsteps once more echo in the halls. But sleep is rarely easy. Dreams come uninvited, heavy with the faces of men who blurred together. Sometimes the dreams are of escape, of walking freely through the streets without stares or whispers. Sometimes they are memories of childhood, of mothers and fathers long gone, of simpler days before survival took such a heavy price. And sometimes the dreams are simply silence, the sweetest escape of all. No voices, no demands, no roles to play, just silence, like the hush of the city before dawn. And then, inevitably, the cycle resets. The sun rises fully, golden light spilling across the tiled rooftops. Children run through the streets. Vendors call out. Water splashes in fountains. Pompeii is alive again. And so too is the loop. The doors unlock. The keeper sits ready, and the women once more prepare themselves. Their hair is combed, their eyes lined, their voices warmed. The illusion must be convincing, even if inside they are weary. Men do not come to see fatigue. They come to see beauty, to feel desire reflected back at them. And so the women, like actresses on a stage, step into their roles once again. What made the Lupina so enduring, so successful, was not simply the acts themselves. It was the fantasy it sustained, night after night, morning after morning. For a small fee, a man could believe he was powerful, wanted, admired. For a few minutes, he could silence the weight of his own struggles, the pressures of trade, politics, or poverty. And though the women knew it was all performance, their livelihood depended on making it real enough to matter. That was the delicate balance. A lie told so well it became truth. At least for a moment, and beyond the walls, life continued. Children grew, families quarreled, merchants sold their wares, gladiators trained in the amphitheater, and the mountain loomed silent and steady above it all. To the women of the Lupina, the mountain was simply part of the backdrop, a fixed point in a world that constantly shifted. They could not know that one day it would roar to life and bury everything beneath ash and stone, freezing their stories forever. They could not imagine that centuries later, strangers from across the world would walk those same rooms, tracing frescoes with reverent fingers, whispering about what had once been. They only knew the next client, the next coin, the next night, and that was life inside Pompeii's brothel. Cyclical, exhausting, fleeting, but strangely enduring. A place where desire and survival intertwined, where illusions were both sold and believed, where the present mattered more than the future. And as the city outside lived and breathed, the Lupinor became its own heartbeat. Steady, hidden, essential dot. By midday, the Lupinor was quieter. The morning rush of laborers and slaves had passed. The city was humming with its daily rhythm, and the brothel's small rooms were briefly empty. The women used these hours to recover, though rest was a relative word. Some lay down on their beds, trying to stretch out their tired muscles, listening to the faint murmur of voices drifting in from the street. Others busied themselves with small acts of care, reapplying kohl to their eyes, fixing their hair, adjusting their thin tunics to sit just so. A few murmured to each other, sharing small jokes or complaints in hushed voices, but always with an ear out for the keeper. Their time was never fully their own. Outside, Pompeii glittered in the sun. The streets shimmered with heat, stones radiating warmth beneath sandaled feet. Children darted between vendors' stalls. Women bargained for fish. Men debated loudly in taverns. And above it all, the ever-present hum of a living city carried on, oblivious to the hidden dramas within the brothel walls. It was a strange duality, the world outside vibrant and public, the world inside intimate and secret. Yet both worlds belonged to Pompeii, both sustained by the same endless cycle of human desire and survival. Sometimes, a woman would slip into the corridor and stand near the doorway, just for a breath of fresh air. The scents of bread, olives, and roasted meat from street vendors mixed with the sharper temps of manure and sweat. To her, even these smells were preferable to the heavy musk of oil lamps and bodies. She would watch the people passing by and wonder if they saw her differently when she stepped outside. Did they avert their eyes, ashamed, or stare too long, curious? Was she invisible or unforgettable? In truth, she was both. Everyone knew the brothel's women, and yet no one truly knew them. The afternoon brought a different kind of client. Wealthier men, merchants with coin to spare, officials with time between duties, travelers drawn by whispers of Pompeii's infamous loop. These men came not in haste but in leisure, lingering longer, sometimes paying for hours instead of minutes. They asked for wine to be brought, for songs to be sung, for massages before the main act. The women obliged, not because they wished to, but because these clients paid well, and their generosity or stinginess could shape the course of a day. Conversation was as much a service as anything else. A merchant might boast about his latest shipment from Alexandria, describing the silks and spices he had secured. A Roman official might complain about politics, the endless bureaucracy of empire. A traveler might tell stories of distant lands, embellishing them with wild gestures and exaggerated claims. The women listened, nodded, laughed at the right moments. Sometimes, they even asked questions, feigning interest, keeping the illusion alive that the client was fascinating, unique, important. In truth, the same stories repeated night after night, city after city, but the illusion was everything. The frescoes on the walls seemed to glow, brighter in the afternoon light, filtering through narrow windows. Their figures, painted in vivid reds, yellows, and blacks, looked almost alive. Clients often pointed to them like choosing from a menu, and the women had long since learned to read those gestures. Some found it tiresome, others amusing, but all understood that the paintings were not just decoration, they were tools. A man could step into the Lupena nervous, unsure of how to ask for what he wanted, and the frescoes did the asking for him. It was a silent language, painted centuries ago, still speaking clearly to anyone who looked. Between clients, the women sometimes traced the outlines of those frescoes with their eyes. What did the artists think as they painted them? Were they laughing, embarrassed, or simply focused on their craft? Did they know that their work would one day outlive the very city? For the women, the paintings were both comforting and cruel. Comforting because they gave structure, rules, expectations. Cruel because they reminded them that their role was eternal, unchanging, immortalized in plaster while they themselves would fade into dust. By late afternoon, the air in the Lupena grew stifling. Heat pressed down on the rooms, the stone walls trapping the warmth until every breath felt heavy. Sweat beaded on foreheads, clothes stuck to skin. The women fanned themselves with scraps of cloth, whispered complaints to one another, but endured. The clients rarely cared about the heat. Desire was stronger than discomfort, and so the cycle continued, bodies moving against the weight of the afternoon sun. Transactions made, roles played. Occasionally, a kind client offered a gift, a sweet pastry, a ribbon, a coin slipped quietly into a hand with no demand attached. Such gestures were rare, but when they came, they were remembered. A ribbon could be tied in the hair, a pastry shared among the women, a coin hidden away as insurance for a future that might never come. Small kindnesses in a world built on transaction became treasures, anchors of hope in an ocean of routine. And still, the mountain stood watch. From the brothel's narrow windows, glimpses of its great shadow could be seen against the sky. To the women, it was background, scenery, something as permanent as the sea. They did not fear it. Why would they? It had always been there, silent, immovable, and yet, knowing what we know now, it is impossible to imagine that looming presence without a chill. Every laugh, every whispered promise, every coin exchanged was happening beneath a ticking clock no one could hear. As evening approached, the rhythm of the brothel shifted again. The women knew the night would be long. The lamps would be lit, the wine would flow, the laughter would rise. Their brief respite in the afternoon was over. They straightened their tunics, adjusted their hair, prepared themselves once more. Outside, Pompeii was alive with the sounds of families gathering for supper, of taverns filling with voices, of the amphitheater preparing for entertainments. Inside, the Lupanor braced itself for another cycle of desire, illusion, and survival. And so, as shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the sky, the brothel doors opened again to the night. As night descended once more, the Lupena came alive in a way that the afternoon could never match. Lamps flared, shadows danced, and the air thickened with the promise of indulgence. Outside, Taverns overflowed with men flushed from wine, their voices carrying down narrow streets. Inside, the brothel was ready, its rhythm as predictable as the rising moon. Curtains swayed, laughter rippled through the halls, and the cycle began again. The women had prepared for this moment carefully, even if they had little energy left. They knew the night brought the wealthier clients, those who had lingered at feasts and drinking parties before finding their way here. These men were loud, extravagant, demanding, and yet more generous with their coin. A night could be lucrative if handled well, though it was rarely easy. Drunkenness made men bolder, rougher, less aware of boundaries. The women braced themselves, hiding their apprehension beneath practiced smiles. The keeper sat at his station near the entrance, his sharp eyes flicking to every man who entered. He collected coins, counted carefully, never missing a fraction. To him, this was not indulgence but business, and he ran it with the efficiency of a merchant guarding his wares. Behind him, the walls of the Lupena glowed with lamplight, the frescoes shining as if they too were awake, eager participants in the night's illusions. Men spilled into the small rooms, some arm in arm, others staggering alone. They joked with each other, sometimes boasting, sometimes daring one another to request what the frescoes displayed. The graffiti on the walls seemed to hum with fresh energy, names scratched into plaster long ago, joining the chorus of laughter and shouts. The Lupena became a theatre, each room a stage, each woman an actress performing roles written long before her time. Inside the rooms, the air was thick with smoke and wine. A man might arrive with a jug of drink, insisting the woman share with him, pressing the cup to her lips. She sipped cautiously, aware that too much would dull her edge. She needed to stay sharp, to control the moment, even as she pretended to yield. The illusion was delicate. He believed he led. She ensured survival. When the curtain fell back, she resumed her place, waiting for the next act. Some men were loud, demanding, careless. Others were quiet, almost shy, speaking little, letting the paintings on the walls do their talking. The women adapted to each, their bodies shifting, their voices softening or sharpening as needed. They were experts in reading men, in predicting their moods, in offering just enough illusion to keep them satisfied. It was not simply physical labor, it was psychological, emotional, theatrical. Each encounter was a performance, and the women were seasoned performers in the larger scheme of Pompeii's nightlife. The Lupena was both notorious and ordinary. Everyone knew it, yet no one spoke of it in daylight. Men who spent their evenings here might sit in the forum the next morning, serious and respectable, never acknowledging the women they had paid hours before. Respectable wives might walk past the brothel in daylight, eyes averted, while inside, women not so different from them played roles that society demanded but despised. It was hypocrisy woven into the fabric of the city, accepted by all, questioned by none. As the night deepened, the Lupena grew hotter, louder, heavier. Wine flowed freely, laughter echoed. The frescoes seemed to watch with painted smiles. The women's bodies ached, but they moved with practiced grace, never breaking character. Their voices grew hoarse, their eyes heavy, but they pressed on. Survival required endurance, and they had long since learned how to endure. There were moments, though fleeting, when cracks appeared in the performance. A woman, left alone for a moment between clients, might close her eyes, lean her head against the cool stone wall, and simply breathe. Another might whisper a quick prayer to Venus, goddess of love, asking for protection, for patience, for strength. A few might exchange glances in the corridor, brief flashes of camaraderie in a world that rarely allowed it. These moments were small, but they were real. They reminded them that beneath the illusion, they were still human. Meanwhile, the mountain loomed in the darkness, its silent presence watching over the city. Men joked inside the brothel, women performed their roles. The keeper counted his coins, and all of it unfolded beneath a shadow no one could see. That is what makes Pompeii's story so haunting. They lived with such certainty, so unaware of how fragile their world truly was. By midnight, the Lupena was at its peak. Every room was full, every fresco seemed alive, every corner pulsed with the rhythm of voices and footsteps. Outside, the streets had quieted, but inside, life burned brightly. This was Pompeii at its most human, raw and unfiltered, a blend of desire, survival, illusion, and routine. And within it all, the women endured, carrying the weight of the night on their shoulders with practiced strength, When the lamps burned low and the clients finally began to drift away, the brothel exhaled again. But for now, it was still alive, still thrumming, still immersed in its endless cycle. When the lupiner finally began to thin out past midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The raucous laughter softened, the footsteps slowed, and the lamplight seemed to waver lower, as if the building itself was tired. The women moved slower now, their faces carefully composed, but their bodies betraying the exhaustion that hours of performance brought. Their hair, once neatly arranged, had loosened. Strands stuck to their temples. Their tunics clung to skin damp with sweat. Yet still, whenever the curtain rustled, they straightened, adjusted, and prepared for one more client. This late at night, the clients who remained were a particular kind. Some were drunk, barely able to stand, seeking only to collapse into someone else's arms before stumbling back home. Others were lonely, speaking more than they touched, pouring out worries about wives, debts, or wars far away. There was a vulnerability to the late-night visitors, a kind of melancholy that came after the wine wore thin and bravado dissolved. The women listened, offered murmurs of comfort, sometimes resting a hand on his shoulder longer than necessary. It was still performance, but softer, gentler, carrying a faint shadow of sincerity. In these hours, the graffiti on the wall seemed to take on a new weight. The scratches of names and boasts carved into the plaster whispered of nights long past, of men who had laughed and bragged in the same rooms. Some had promised to return, some had claimed undying passion. Some had left crude drawings that made the women roll their eyes even now. To the women, these words were ghost echoes of men who had vanished, leaving nothing behind but shallow scratches. Yet those ghosts lingered, reminding them that they were not the first, nor would they be the last, to endure these walls. The keeper, too, showed signs of fatigue. He leaned heavier on his stool, his eyes blinking slower as he counted coins, the rhythmic clink sounding more like a lullaby than business. Still, he missed nothing. If a client lingered too long, if a woman stepped out for air, if a coin slipped from the tally, he noticed his control was absolute, even in weariness. The women depended on him, despised him, feared him, sometimes all at once. His presence was as constant as the frescoes, another part of the brothel's unchanging rhythm. And yet, despite the monotony, there were always small surprises. A man might suddenly sing drunkenly in the corridor, startling laughter from even the most tired women. Another might fall asleep mid-act, snoring loudly while the woman carefully disentangled herself, rolling her eyes before covering him with a blanket. Sometimes, a client would offer an unexpected kindness, a gentle word, a soft touch that felt less like transaction and more like humanity. These moments were rare, but they flickered in memory like stars in a dark sky, brief, beautiful, and gone too soon. Outside, the city was asleep. Only the occasional bark of a dog, the distant hoot of an owl, or the faint footsteps of a watchman disturbed the silence. The contrast was stark. Within the Lupina, the night pulsed with heat and life. Beyond its doors, Pompeii rested peacefully beneath the shadow of the mountain. The two worlds coexisted, rarely touching, yet both essential to the city's heartbeat. For the women, the night felt endless. Each client blurred into the next, each moment folding into the one before. Time was measured not in hours, but in encounters, not in sun or moon, but in coins. And yet, somewhere deep within, each woman carried a private clock of her own dreams of freedom, of saving enough to escape, of finding a patron who might offer protection. These dreams were fragile, often crushed by reality, but they persisted. Hope, however faint, was the one luxury they allowed themselves. As dawn crept closer, the energy in the Lupinar waned. The women's voices grew softer, the clients fewer, the lamps lower. Soon, the keeper would shutter the doors, the women would lie down, and the city outside would wake to a new day. But for now, in these final hours of night, the brothel was a world unto itself, a place of illusion, desire, endurance, and survival. And through it all, the mountain loomed, silent and steady, a reminder that nothing, not even this cycle, was eternal. By the time the faintest grey touched the horizon, the Lupina had grown strangely quiet. The last of the drunkards stumbled out into the still streets, their sandals scraping against the stone, leaving behind the muffled echoes of their laughter. Inside, the women were finally released from their long night of performance. Their shoulders sagged as if the weight of the hours pressed down all at once. For a moment, there was silence, heavy and almost holy, the kind that only comes after endless noise. The women moved slowly, almost mechanically, as they began to tidy the small rooms. Sheets were shaken out, though they could never quite shake away the smells of sweat and wine. Oil lamps were snuffed one by one, their smoke curling into the low ceiling before fading into the dawn. The flickering shadows gave way to pale light seeping in through cracks, washing the painted frescoes in a dull, ghostly glow. What had seemed vibrant under lamplight, the painted lovers, the erotic scenes, looked tired in the morning. Even art was not immune to exhaustion. Some of the women sat down heavily on their straw pallets, stretching their legs and rubbing sore muscles. The hours of posing, smiling, and entertaining took their toll. They leaned against the cold stone walls, eyes half murmuring in hushed voices about nothing in particular, what food they hoped for later, how their feet ached, or which client had been the most ridiculous that night. There was comfort in this small talk, a reminder that despite the illusion of the night, they were still human, still sharing laughter among themselves. The keeper's mood softened slightly at this hour. He was tired, too, and though his authority remained, he spoke less sharply, his voice carrying the gravel of sleeplessness. He collected the final coins with methodical care, stacking them neatly into a small wooden box. Money was the true heartbeat of the brothel, the silent overseer of every act, every performance, every sigh. The women watched the coins with complicated eyes, resentment, resignation, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Each coin was both a shackle and a possibility. Outside, Pompeii was stirring. Bakers lit their ovens. The smell of bread carried faintly on the morning air. Farmers drove their carts toward the market, their voices rising in early chatter. Children darted through alleys, chasing one another in games before errands began. The contrast was almost cruel, the city waking to freshness, while the women of the Lupaina collapsed into sleep. Their day was inverted, their lives forever out of rhythm with the rest of the world. Some of the women took this time, before sleep, to whisper prayers, tiny offerings to Venus or Fortuna, muttered with closed eyes and weary lips, a plea for kinder clients, for protection from disease, for a chance at something more than this cycle. Whether the gods listened, no one could say, but hope was stitched into those whispered prayers, hope that tomorrow might be different. Even if yesterday and today had been the same. Others let their minds wander in silence. They thought of families they had lost, of lovers who had abandoned them, of villages far from Pompeii where the sun still rose on fields and orchards instead of plastered walls. Memory was both comfort and pain, a private possession that no client, no keeper, could take away. In dreams and daydreams, they reclaimed a part of themselves that the brothel could not consume. As the morning brightened, the women finally allowed themselves to lie down. Their bodies curled instinctively into rest, arms wrapped around themselves or draped over a companion in shared warmth. The rooms grew quiet again, filled only with the sound of slow breathing. The Lupaina, so alive just hours before, seemed almost abandoned in the light of day. It became a place of stillness, waiting for night to return and the cycle to begin again. And above it all, the mountain stood watch. Its peak caught the first glow of sunlight, serene and eternal, a silent reminder of forces far greater than coins, clients, or painted walls. None in the Lupaina paid it much mind, yet it was there, always there, holding secrets of a future none could imagine. For now, though the women slept, the keeper counted, and Pompeii lived another morning in the shadow of a destiny. Unspoken, the city outside continued to grow louder as the sun climbed higher, but inside the Lupaina, the silence held steady, like a bubble preserved against the world. The narrow hallways seemed longer in daylight, the plastered walls showing cracks that the shadows had hidden overnight. The painted frescoes, once bold invitations to indulgence, now looked almost pitiful under the harsh light. Some were faded, chipped at the edges, the colors dulled by years of smoke and touch. Yet even in their weariness, they told a story of what men desired, of what women had to provide, and of the bargain struck between fantasy and flesh. In the central room, where most of the clients had passed through during the night, the air was heavy with the mingled scent of sweat, wine, and extinguished oil lamps. A few stray sandals and discarded cloaks were left behind, forgotten in drunken departure. The keeper would gather these later, either to return for a fee or to keep as compensation. Nothing went to waste here. Even loss was turned into profit. The women who had managed to fall asleep early now stirred faintly as the morning pressed on. Dreams carried them to places that felt far away from the cramped brothel. Some dreamed of running fields, their bare feet brushing against grass instead of cold stone. Others dreamed of warm kitchens, the smell of stews bubbling on a hearth. Still others dreamed of lovers who were kind, who touched them not out of purchase but out of affection. The cruelest part was waking, when the weight of reality returned and the walls reminded them where they were. By midday, the keeper returned to the women's quarters, his sandals tapping on the floor. He was not cruel in this moment, but brisk. The rooms needed cleaning, beds had to be shaken out, floors swept, basins of water refreshed. A new night would come soon enough, and the house had to be ready. The women, though tired, obeyed. It was easier to follow the rhythm than to resist. They moved slowly, voices low, exchanging small words about the previous night's guests. Some of these stories made them laugh. A client who fell asleep too quickly, another who bragged endlessly about his wealth, but counted every coin with suspicion. Laughter, even soft and fleeting, was a form of survival. They washed themselves as best they could, pouring cool water over their faces and arms, scrubbing away the traces of the night. The brothel did not offer luxuries of perfumed oils or fine baths, but water was water, and in those moments it felt like renewal. One girl braided her hair again, her fingers nimble despite her fatigue, while another pinned hers up with a broken comb. Appearances mattered. The clients wanted beauty, or at least the illusion of it, in the corner. One of the older women sat quietly, her back against the wall. Her face carried lines etched by years of service, her eyes both sharp and distant. She watched the younger ones fuss over their hair and whispered advice now and then. How to smile without showing too much eagerness, how to guide a man's expectations, how to survive another night. Her presence was a reminder that this life could stretch on for years, a cycle without clear escape. Yet she also carried a strange strength, the resilience of one who had endured. Outside, Pompeii bustled. Market stalls clattered with voices haggling over fish and vegetables. Donkeys brayed as they pulled carts along the uneven stone roads. The scent of baking bread filled the air, mingling with the salt of the sea carried inland by breezes. For those walking past the brothel, it was just another building among many unremarkable in the daylight. Only those who knew its purpose gave it a glance, and even then, they often looked quickly away. Respectable citizens pretended not to notice, though many of them had likely stepped through its doors after nightfall. As the afternoon wore on, the heat built up within the stone walls. The small rooms grew stifling, and the women fanned themselves with scraps of cloth. Their bodies, already weary, sagged further under the oppressive warmth. They drank water slowly, sharing bowls passed between them, their laughter subdued by exhaustion. A few managed to steal another hour of sleep, lying on their sides, hair plastered to their damp foreheads. Rest was always shallow, never enough. The keeper, meanwhile, counted again. Coins clinked softly as he spread them out on a table, his fingers quick and precise. He muttered to himself about debts, about supplies needed for the house oil for the lamps, bread for the women, perhaps new sheets if the old ones tore beyond use. Every decision balanced between expense and profit. He never forgot that the women were both his investment and his livelihood. Compassion had little place here. Practicality ruled. As evening approached, the rhythm shifted once more. Lamps were trimmed and relit, their flames softening the room into familiar shadows. The painted frescoes seemed to wake again, glowing faintly as if eager for night's return. The women readied themselves with slow deliberation, smoothing their hair, adjusting their tunics, sitting straighter despite the ache in their backs. They knew the performance was about to begin again, and whether they felt ready or not, the show would go on. That there was a pause, a moment of held breath. As the sun dipped low and the city began its nightly transformation, street vendors packed up, taverns grew louder, and men once again drifted toward the narrow alley where the lupanar stood. Soon, footsteps echoed outside, laughter and muttered voices drawing nearer. The women exchanged glances, some resigned, some weary, some practiced enough to conceal their feelings entirely. The keeper straightened his tunic, pocketed his coin pouch, and moved toward the door. And then, as if on cue, the first knock came. The night was beginning again. The door creaked open, and the first clients of the evening spilled into the narrow hall, their voices already carrying the slurred edges of drink. They smelled of wine and roasted meat, their laughter bouncing against the walls like a crude drumbeat. The keeper greeted them with his usual blend of gruffness and forced charm. ushering them inside as though they were esteemed guests at a banquet, rather than men looking to escape into shadows. Coins clinked as palms met, the ritual exchange that turned strangers into temporary masters of the house. The women, already in place, adjusted their posture. Smiles appeared like masks carefully tied on, practiced so often they seemed natural. They leaned against painted walls or perched on the edge of beds, eyes lowered just enough to seem inviting but not too bold. It was a performance honed over countless nights, where every gesture carried weight. A tilt of the head could suggest shyness. A flicker of a smile could spark interest. They were actresses without a stage, dancers without music, yet their theater was no less demanding. The men moved down the hallway, some pausing to study the frescoes, chuckling at the explicit scenes painted long ago by artists who had understood exactly what this place was meant for. Others peered into the small rooms, appraising the women as though they were goods in a market stall. There was no pretense here, no need to dress their desire in polite language. They asked blunt questions, laughed at their own jokes, and bargained over the smallest details. The women played along, their voices soft, their movements fluid, coaxing the men into choosing quickly, efficiently. One girl, younger than most, caught the eye of a man with a heavy gold ring. He swaggered toward her, his words thick with drink, his hand already reaching as though possession had been decided before consent. She smiled, not too eagerly, and let herself be led into the room. The curtain fell behind them, and the sounds of whispered negotiation mixed with the creak of the bed frame. In another room, an older woman entertained a pair of men who laughed loudly, tossing dice as though the outcome of their game mattered as much as the pleasure they sought. The night fractured into fragments, each room carrying its own story, its own rhythm. The keeper moved between rooms, listening, watching, ensuring no one lingered too long without payment. His eyes were sharp, his ears tuned to the smallest sign of trouble. A fight could break out easily, two men arguing over the same woman, or a client pushing past the limits agreed upon. His presence was both protection and pressure. For the women, it was a reminder that their safety depended not on kindness but on control, that the thin thread keeping chaos at bay was tied around the keeper's authority. As the night deepened, the air grew heavy again with heat and voices. The women's laughter floated through the halls, practiced and hollow, yet convincing enough to keep the men at ease. Sometimes, between clients, they let their smiles slip for just a moment, their eyes dulling with exhaustion. But then footsteps echoed again, and the mask returned, seamless as ever. Their bodies ached, their throats dry from forced laughter, but the rhythm carried them forward. In the common space where wine was poured into cheap cups, men gathered between visits. They boasted about conquests, exaggerated their wealth, and teased each other with crude jokes. Some sang, their voices off-key, filling the air with rowdy energy. The women drifted in and out, brushing past shoulders, letting fingers graze arms, keeping the illusion alive. Even those not currently chosen were still part of the performance, their presence necessary to maintain the atmosphere of abundance. Now and then, a quieter man slipped through the noise, his steps uncertain, his gaze lingering not on the frescoes or the laughter, but on the women themselves. For these men, the brothel was less about bravado and more about escape. They came seeking touch, conversation, the brief comfort of being seen. Some women preferred these clients, for though they still paid, their demands were gentler, their words less sharp. Yet even tenderness here was fleeting, bound tightly to the exchange of coins. As hours passed, fatigue crept in again. The women felt it in their backs, their legs, the dull ache of repetition. But there was no pause, no chance to rest until the tide of clients began to ebb. They adjusted, endured, found small ways to lighten the burden. A whispered joke between two women passing in the hallway, a shared glance that said more than words ever could. These small rebellions, quiet and unseen, kept their spirits from breaking entirely. Outside, Pompeii's streets pulsed with life. Taverns spilled laughter and drunken songs into the night air. Torches flickered against the stone walls, and the sound of cartwheels echoed faintly from distant alleys. The city thrived in its own rhythm, unaware or uninterested in the stories unfolding inside the Lupena. To most, the brothel was simply a fact of life, a building known but rarely spoken of in daylight. Yet within these walls, lives unfolded night after night, marked by repetition and survival, by the strange balance of power and vulnerability. By the time the moon reached its height, the Lupena was in full motion. Every room was occupied, the frescoes glowing faintly in the lamplight, as though mocking the reality they framed. The keeper moved through his domain like a conductor, ensuring the music never faltered, the rhythm never broke, and the women, weary yet unyielding, continued their performance, each gesture carrying them further into the night. For those watching closely, there was beauty here, not the beauty of painted walls or practiced smiles, but the quiet beauty of resilience, of women who endured, who found fragments of laughter in the midst of exhaustion, who carried hope like a hidden ember, even as the world reduced them to shadows. It was a beauty unseen by most, invisible beneath the masks, but it burned quietly, waiting. And so the night pressed on, relentless, as the Lupaina once again fulfilled its role in Pompeii's endless cycle of desire, money, and survival. As the night stretched on and the wine flowed thicker, the Lupaina became a theater of extremes. The laughter grew louder, the boasts more ridiculous, the footsteps heavier, yet beneath the noise, there was an undercurrent of weariness settling into every corner of the house. The walls seemed to breathe with the echoes of 100 voices, shadows lengthening and swaying in the lamplight, as if the frescoes themselves had come alive, mocking or imitating the scenes unfolding in the rooms. In one chamber, the curtain swayed as a man stumbled out, adjusting his tunic with a satisfied grin, leaving behind a woman who collapsed against the wall the moment he was gone. Her smile dissolved into a blank stare, her body limp with exhaustion. For a brief moment, she let herself be simply still, feeling the rough plaster cool against her cheek. Then, hearing the shuffle of approaching footsteps, she pulled herself upright again, smoothing her hair, pulling her mask back on. Another woman, bolder than most, sat on the edge of her bed, her voice carrying into the hallway as she teased the men passing by. She called them names with a playful edge, daring them to laugh, daring them to choose her. Her humor was sharp, her wit quick, and though it sometimes earned her a slap of annoyance, it also kept her in demand. Not every client wanted a docile shadow. Some wanted fire, and she knew how to kindle it. Survival came in many forms, and for her, it was laughter wrapped around defiance. The keeper watched it all with practiced detachment. He had seen too many nights like this to be moved by either cruelty or tenderness. His eyes scanned the hallways, his ears catching every sound, the muffled giggle, the clink of coins, the raised voice of an argument brewing. Twice he stepped in to separate men who quarreled, his presence a silent reminder that the house had rules, and he was the enforcer. Trouble was bad for business, and business was the only thing that mattered. Beyond the walls of the brothel, Pompeii's nightlife surged. The taverns rang with music, dice games scattered coins across wooden tables, and lovers slipped into alleys under torchlight. The city was alive with indulgence, 1,000 small escapes unfolding in tandem, yet the Lupaina remained its own world, hidden from polite conversation, thriving in secrecy even as everyone knew of its existence. Men who laughed here loudly in the night would pass the same building silently by day, their eyes fixed elsewhere, their tongues tied by shame or pride. Inside, the hours dragged. The women found small ways to measure the passing of time, the number of clients seen, the dwindling oil in the lamps, the way the night air cooled as the moon shifted in the sky. Some counted in silence, marking each visit as though tallying the beats of a drum. Others tried not to think of time at all, slipping into a rhythm where moments blurred, where the night became a single, endless performance. Occasionally, a client would stay longer than most, lingering in conversation rather than rushing through the expected motions. These men sometimes spoke of their families, their work, their fears. They confessed secrets in the dim light, trusting women who had no choice but to listen. For the women, these conversations were strange reprieves. They listened with polite nods, sometimes offering soft words in return. It was not friendship, not truly, but it felt different enough to matter. In those moments, they were more than bodies for purchase. They were ears, companions, fleeting confessions in the dark. Yet such clients were rare. More often, the encounters were swift, transactional, forgotten as quickly as they began. The men left satisfied, or half-satisfied. Coins dropped into waiting hands, while the women resumed their positions, ready for the next. The cycle repeated with mechanical precision, a rhythm too familiar to need thought. By the deep hours of the night, the pace began to slow. The streets outside grew quieter as taverns emptied and drunkards stumbled home. The footsteps that approached the brothel grew fewer, and the keeper's coin box grew heavier. He counted again, lips moving silently, stacking coins with care. His satisfaction was a quiet hum in the background, a counterpoint to the women's fatigue. Some women, between clients, leaned against each other for support, a head resting on his shoulder, a hand clasped briefly in another's. These small gestures, unnoticed by the men, were lifelines. In the brief silences, they reminded one another that they were still there, still enduring together. It was solidarity born not of choice but of necessity, a shared strength in the face of repetition. The lamplight flickered as oil ran low, casting long, wavering shadows across the frescoes. The painted figures seemed almost to move, caught in their eternal embrace, frozen in poses that promised pleasure, but betrayed none of the exhaustion that filled the room. The women looked at them sometimes, half in mockery, half in resignation. The frescoes never aged, never tired, never broke under the weight of endless nights. The women envied and despised them in equal measure. At last, as the moon began its slow descent, the clients dwindled to almost none. A final man staggered out, mumbling his thanks, his sandals scraping across the stone floor as he disappeared into the quiet streets. The keeper closed the door firmly behind him, sliding the bolt with a sound that echoed through the house like a sigh. The night was over, or nearly so. The women, though free from clients for the moment, were not yet free to rest. There was tidying to be done, beds to straighten, floors to sweep, lamps to extinguish. They moved with heavy limbs, their eyes half closed, their bodies begging for rest. Yet they carried out the tasks automatically, as though their hands remembered what their minds were too weary to hold. Only when the last lamp was out, the last curtain drawn, did they allow themselves to collapse. One by one, they lay down on straw pallets or narrow beds, their breathing slowing as exhaustion claimed them. Some curled tightly, as if to protect themselves even in sleep. Others sprawled, too tired to care. Whispers faded into silence, and the Lupena grew quiet once again. Outside, the first faint light of dawn began to touch the sky. Pompeii stirred, preparing for another day, its streets washed in gold and grey. Inside, behind thick walls, the women slept, dreaming of faraway places, of lives that might have been, of freedom always just beyond reach. And above them all, the mountain loomed, silent, patient, holding its secret. Morning crept into the city slowly, the pale light softening the sharp edges of the stone streets. Pompeii awoke with the sound of vendors setting up their stalls, the crackle of ovens being stoked, and the calls of children darting through the alleys. But inside the brothel, time moved differently. The women slept through the noise, their bodies claiming the rest denied them all night. The air was heavy with the residue of the evening smoke from the lamps, the musk of sweat, the faint sourness of spilled wine. It was not pleasant, yet in sleep, the women found a kind of refuge. The keeper let them rest for a while. He had business of his own in the morning, accounts to settle, supplies to order, bribes to pay. He locked away the coin box in a chest with an iron clasp, the sound of metal clinking final and reassuring. Then he left the house for the market, his footsteps brisk, his eyes sharp. He walked among other men with the same purpose, blending seamlessly into the city's commerce. Few would guess, watching him weigh fruit or haggle over olive oil, that his livelihood rested on shadows and whispers. Inside, silence reigned. The women shifted in their sleep, murmuring dreams into the still air. Some dreamed of laughter, others of loss. For a few hours, they escaped the cycle, their minds wandering to places their bodies could not. One dreamed of a child she had not seen in years, another of the countryside, where she had once gathered flowers before her life turned toward stone walls. These dreams were bittersweet, filled with longing but also with the fleeting sweetness of remembering something softer. By midday, the house stirred again. The women rose slowly, stretching limbs stiff from straw bedding. They washed their faces with cool water, braided their hair, and prepared simple meals. Bread torn by hand, dipped in oil, sometimes a few olives, if fortune was kind. It was not a feast, but it was enough to fill the stomach and give strength for what was to come. The kitchen was small, just a corner with a hearth, but it was theirs, and in those quiet hours it felt almost domestic. They talked softly as they ate, their laughter, gentler now, unforced. For a brief time, there were simply women sharing food, not performers bound to masks. After eating, the work of the day began. Sheets were shaken out again, straw replaced where it had thinned, curtains mended if torn. The walls were wiped down, though no amount of scrubbing could ever erase the layers of years pressed into plaster. The women worked together, their hands moving in rhythm, their voices humming fragments of songs. These tasks, though menial, were a kind of ritual, a way of reclaiming small control over their space. Occasionally, passers-by glanced into the doorway as the women swept the floors. Some sneered, others smirked knowingly, a few looked quickly away. Respectable citizens would never admit to visiting such a place, though their silence often concealed guilt. For the women, the gazers were background noise, as constant as the distant cries of vendors. They had long since grown numb to judgment. In the afternoon, the heat built again. The thick stone walls trapped the warmth, and the air grew stifling. The women fanned themselves, sweat beading along their temples, their tunics clinging to their backs. Some retreated to the coolest corners, pressing themselves against the walls for relief. They rested when they could, saving their strength for the night. Time passed slowly, measured in the dripping of water from basins, the lazy buzz of flies hovering near scraps of food. Their keeper returned before evening, his arms full of supplies. He barked instructions as he set down bundles of bread, jars of oil, new clay cups to replace the ones broken. He inspected the rooms with a critical eye, ensuring everything was in order. His business depended on the house's appearance. Clients wanted illusion, not reality. The women listened silently, nodding where necessary, ignoring the edge in his tone. They had heard it all before. As the sun dipped lower, anticipation began again. The women dressed with care, pinning their hair, smoothing their tunics, preparing their voices for another night of laughter. Their movements were practiced, but there was still a pause in the air, a hesitation before the curtain rose on the same performance once more. Some sat quietly, staring into the distance, gathering strength. Others chatted, filling the silence with talk of the market, the smell of fresh bread outside, the gossip overheard in passing. These fragments of the world beyond the walls tethered them to life outside the cycle. However faintly, when the first footsteps approached, the rhythm of the night began anew. The keeper straightened, the lamps were lit, the frescoes glowed again in the soft light. The women shifted into their roles, their smiles appearing like clockwork. The knock at the door came, steady and inevitable, and the keeper opened it wide. Once again, Pompeii entered, bringing with it the noise, the laughter, the hunger. The cycle spun forward, relentless, as it always had, as it always wouldn't till the day the city's story ended, not in shadows but in fire and ash. But none of them knew that yet. For now, it was just another night, just another beginning. The laughter spilled out into the street again, mingling with the hum of Pompeii's nightlife. The wine shops were busy, the amphitheater echoed faintly with distant cheers, and in the narrow lanes, the brothel's doorway glowed like a beacon for those seeking escape. Each man who entered carried with him a piece of the outside world's stories of trade, of politics, of family, and for a brief time, those fragments were shared within the walls, wrapped in whispers and sighs. For the women, the night moved both quickly and slowly. Hours blurred together in the repetition of faces, voices, footsteps, a man with rough hands smelling of leather, a young soldier laughing too loudly, an older merchant with sadness buried in his eyes. Each encounter was a story, though not all were told. Some spoke while lying in the small rooms, confessions spilling easier in the dark than they ever could in daylight. Others remained silent, seeking only the comfort of flesh and the illusion of closeness. The women listened, responded, gave fragments of themselves, then let the curtain fall and the next scene begin. Between clients, there were pauses. In those pauses, the women breathed. They leaned against the walls, whispered to one another, shared quick gulps of watered wine. Their eyes grew heavy, but their smiles reappeared at the sound of the next knock. They had become masters of shifting, slipping between selves, as easily as changing a mask in a play. Outside, the streets rang with festival laughter, but inside, the brothel kept its steady rhythm, an unending pulse. The keeper, always watchful, paced like a conductor of this strange performance. He counted coins, soothed impatient clients, barked at the women to move faster when demand grew high. Yet even he knew the night had limits. Eventually, the city would tire, the lamps would burn low, and the house would fall back into silence. And so it did. One by one, the clients departed, their sandals scraping against the stones as they disappeared into the maze of Pompeii's alleys. The air grew cooler, the laughter faded, the torches guttered low. Inside, the women exhaled the night. They unpinned their hair, stretched aching limbs, and shared quiet words before sinking once more onto their straw beds, their eyes closed, heavy with exhaustion, but also with a small relief of survival. Another night completed, another step in the endless cycle. The keeper locked the door, the final sound of the bolt sliding home sealing them in. Outside, the city slept under the stars, unaware of how little time remained before everything would be swallowed in silence forever. But for now, life continued. The brothel waited for the next day, the next night, the next story. And as we leave them there, drifting into uneasy dreams, the hum of Pompeii fading into the distance, it feels like the right moment to close our eyes too. History is never as far away as it seems. In these walls, in these voices, it lingers, whispering through time. So let the noise of the ancient streets soften, let the lamps dim, let the curtain fall. The night is quiet now, and it's time for rest. Good night.